We're going to be here talking with you about Azure migration and migrating your data center to Azure. And I'm going to turn on my web camera now. Webcam. Share my webcam. There you go. Can I get a thumbs up, Mike, if you can see me? I can see you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So we've got myself here, Wade Walker, Director of Cloud Services here at Big Green IT, and then Mike Procker, our Chief Operating Officer and also our VP of Cloud Services. I'm going to be doing most of the talking, so you get to hear my voice a lot. Mike will be helping to moderate, check any questions you might have, and then interrupt me with any questions or make any suggestions along the way. So let us begin on our Azure migration discussion. Introduction, hey, you've got me, so I'm doing the introduction here. Already mentioned Mike Procker. We're gonna hit on this agenda of hitting on Azure, kind of a baseline assessment. When we talk about migrations, we always go, hey, and we kind of have to assess what's going on in this situation. How do we do this? What are the planning and testing methodologies? And then it's, hey, great, I've migrated, now what? So we'll hit on that as well. Pricing's always a big part of any Azure discussion. Going to also hit on the 2021 roadmap, and the roadmap also goes retrospectively, so we'll hit on that. And then a little Q&A on Azure. So that's where open forum for you to ask any questions. And again, ask questions along the way. And then please note, as is normal with any Big Green IT webinar, everyone who's attending will get a copy of this presentation. So don't feel like you've got to write things down or type, super duper fastly. Just realize we're going to send out the slide deck to you, and in the slide deck is going to be links to all of the various services and websites that we bring up along the way. So away we go. We get this a lot. Who is Big Green IT? We're company's been around 7-8 years now. One of our favorite quotes from one of our long-standing customers is some thanks they gave us for a big project. Obviously last year, COVID pandemic was weird, so we helped them out with some big projects. We're going to hit on the pandemic a little later on, no surprise. We're headquartered in the Rockland, Sacramento. Rockland's just a little bit north of downtown Sacramento. We have offices down in the San Diego area. That's where I'm located. I'm in Carlsbad, California, about 30 minutes north of San Diego. And we have an office in LA as well. Fastest growing company back in 2017, and that continues today. We're still continuing to grow. And something we like a lot and we really value at this organization is we've been one of the best places to work here in the Sacramento Business Journal, kind of a 4-peat. So we did 1 in a row, then 2 in a row, 3-peat, and then we did a 4-peat last year. So that was really good to have a nice growth trajectory of best places to work, especially during a very interesting 2020 for us and for everybody else. As it relates to Azure, we're considered a gold platform partner, which means we're at the highest level of, what's that?
You can be glad to be gold, it's fine.
Glad to be gold. Platform partner, which is on Azure. We're also gold on a number of other services and features within Microsoft, including Office 365 and more. We're a tier 1 reseller of Azure, means we resell the Azure service right to you. And we're also what Microsoft calls a managed partner. So we have a team at Microsoft that we work with, and we can get on the bat phone, so to speak, and call developers and engineers. And it's actually really important from an Azure standpoint that we're a managed partner and that we're in that next bullet there, data center optimization. Mike and I and our entire company, we have direct access to Microsoft engineers, including those people that actually wrote the code for some of these services. So if we're doing some research for our clients or prospects and trying to get to the bottom of something brand new, there's a brand new thing called Azure Communication Services, which helps integrate some SMS with messaging with Office 365. Brand new thing in preview, Mike and I might use that bat phone and get on the call with the people that developed the code for it and make sure we get it implemented and deployed correctly for our clients. And also here on the bottom, you'll see a listing of some of our top clients. Some are pretty well known. And then we also have a number of clients in the, ranging from 20 users or less up to 1,000 users. So that's kind of a good little snapshot of who is Big Green IT. Now we're going to hit on on the meat of the presentation, which is Azure migration. We're going to have a couple of poll questions coming up right now. One's going to come up. What is Azure? So let me look at my other screen here and click, are you using Azure today? So that poll is out here. So if you can just click a simple yes, no, let us know if you're using Azure today. That'd be great, because then I can curate my content and my presentation based on the audience responses. All right, we're kind of at a 40% yes, 60% no ratio. Keep your votes coming in. We count all votes. All right, we're going to give 5 more seconds here. We're sticking out a nice 40% yes, 60% no. All right, I'm going to close this poll in a couple more seconds. Bam. Okay, thank you for that. So I've got a couple pivots that I'll do here to make sure that for those of you that aren't using Azure, I want to make sure I address, that key components of Azure from your perspective. And then again, along the way, if you have any questions and you have just, want to hear some more things about Azure, type them away. Mike Proctor will be answering and then interrupting me if needed.
And Wade, I want to mention one thing real quick for anybody that doesn't know. On your screen now, there's a bar that separates the webcams from the presentation. You can resize that any way you want. So if the slide's not as big as you'd like and you're stuck looking at our faces, you can just drag that bar higher and get more of the presentation there. Just wanted to point that out.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you for that, Mike. So before we talk about what is Azure, where is Azure? This is actually a very important discussion as far as where is Azure, what is it, and where is it? Azure is basically data centers throughout the world. So there's 60 different regions throughout the world, and 140 different countries where Azure is located. Azure is basically a data center that Microsoft manages with servers and storage and power and air conditioning and redundancy and everything. But you can see here it's got a huge presence throughout the world. Basically, it's the second largest network in the world. Only network bigger is the internet, which Azure is actually a huge component of the internet. And then Azure has direct connections between their data centers. So they're not, we have customers and clients that have some Azure services in multiple data centers throughout the United States. And it's important to note that the data that's going back and forth between these data centers rides on Microsoft's networking and is encrypted along the way. And it's not just a Microsoft operating system or Microsoft services running in Azure. Microsoft runs Azure runs Windows Server virtual machines, also runs Linux. Linux is actually more than 50% of the virtual machines out there. There's also Microsoft things or databases and database as a service, where you can run a database as a standalone service and not requiring a Windows server or Linux server running underneath it. And Microsoft has those databases as services for both Microsoft SQL Server and MySQL. So the open source community is very well represented in Azure, which is a good paradigm shift Microsoft's had the past, let's say 5+ years, 10 years. We're really allowing for more than just Microsoft services to be running in its data centers. About 98, 99% of Fortune 500s are running in Azure today, and some good examples are Chipotle, Coca-Cola, Xbox, no surprise Xbox, AccuWeather, and more. So there's a lot of companies these days running at least something in Azure, and then considering to put more services throughout this year and throughout this decade. And not only is Azure worldwide, it's also the most secure and the most trusted public cloud, with more certifications and compliance settings than any other provider out there, more than GCP, more than AWS. I know this is an eye chart listing of all of these services. We do have links here at the bottom left and bottom right, and then these links will also be available. I summarize many of these links at the end of this presentation. But if you're having to deal with your healthcare company, having to deal with HIPAA, California company dealing with California Consumer Privacy Act, many of us that have to deal with GDPR, global data protection, which is mostly in Europe, but as for companies that deal with clients all over, you have to deal with that. There's these NIST standards, NIST 800, 171, and 53, which are getting more prominence, and as well as the newer cyber security maturity model, CMMC. So there really isn't any public cloud out there that has more security and compliance configurations and settings than Microsoft's Azure. Overlapping those two types of, or those two slides together, here's a relatively newer view of the Azure Environment Map with some of the compliance offerings, some of the worldwide compliance offerings that are included in Azure. So again, very important to know that it's extremely secure, a lot of compliance requirements, and it's a shared security and compliance model where Microsoft does some of the work to make their stuff compliant, and then it's up to the client and then partners like us to help the client to configure settings to ensure that the security posture and compliance posture meets within their needs. And so while that was a higher level overview of what Azure is and where Azure is, for those of you that haven't used Azure, you might be asking, well, geez, Wade, that's great. You gave me pictures, but like, does it run servers? Does it run storage? Like, what exactly is in there? And this slide here, and a quote from Microsoft, how Azure's ever expanding set of cloud services. And we've listed some of the services that are in Azure. I'll just kind of go from upper right to left or whatever, but or in the middle there, big data warehouse. So a lot of servers and storage running, information in Azure to have the servers and storage there, and all the extract, transform, load, the ETL processes for reporting. Obviously, virtual machines are in Azure. Storage is in Azure. Web applications, we've got a client that does a mindful meditation app, and that app runs in Azure and is available to you on your iPhone or your Android. There's business intelligence and analytics in there, Internet of Things. And then kind of on the bottom right there, I've always included Microsoft apps, but something we get asked a lot that I wanted to add in here is if you're running Office 365 or Microsoft 365, those phrases are kind of synonymous. Microsoft 365, Office 365 runs in an Azure data center. So if you are using Office 365, you should really consider Azure for some of your servers, storage, backup, databases, the list goes on, because it's already in the same data center that your Office 365 services are in, and they share the same user ID and password with the Azure Active Directory. So this gets a little more granular as to what is Azure. And for those that haven't looked at it or are just kicking the tires, wanted to speak to this a little bit more because a lot of times where people start with Azure is on a backup, just backing up data to Azure or storing some old historical archive data that barely ever gets touched. There's different storage tiers in Azure, so you can pay very little for data that gets touched, very infrequently. So feel free, ask questions along the way as I'm hitting on these things. Mike's ready to answer them. And I really want to make sure we hit on, what the key components are in here in Azure, especially for those that have not even touched it yet. So where do you start? This is great, Wade. You've talked about it again, but like, where do we want to start? We want to touch Azure. What do we do? Is there a baseline assessment or what happens? And we start talking about this discussion of like Azure and where do we start? It's usually it's these migration and modernization triggers that we put together. We put this together based on a lot of the input we get from our clients and what we see along the way and the migrations we've been doing, and then the management of Azure data with our many Azure customers. What starts first usually to trigger a migration to Azure is your data center contract is expiring, or your building contract is expiring, and you need to now move your servers, your storage, your networking, whatever it is, out of a data center or colo, and then from there into Azure. So that's one of the most recent or common occurrences we see to trigger people moving their information into Azure. Another is the M&A world, mergers and acquisitions. If you're acquiring a company and they need to stand up something really quickly for the employees that are becoming your own, or move their data somewhere, or move their data center somewhere, that is another very common trigger. This third one, I chuckle at because we had it third here. This basically became number one last year because of the pandemic. Urgent capacity needs. We have a gaming and hospitality, a travel gaming and hospitality customer in Alabama. They're about 4,500 employees, and they had to send their hotel management staff work from home. It was a pandemic, right? So we're all working from home. And these people are very accustomed to being in their office. And we all know that, we make a hotel reservation online or a phone call and get our reservation. Well, when you're talking to an agent, he or she at this client, well, they used to work in the office full time, but during the pandemic, they all had to work at home. And so quite suddenly, that capacity need shifted for this customer. Their hotel management workers are at home and they're pounding the VPN and trying to get in and pounding the external bandwidth, getting in, trying to connect in externally to make the hotel reservations. So all of a sudden, an urgent capacity need, and we work with this client to actually stand up an Azure instance for them and move those services from their on-premises to Azure so that employees who are now working from home can actually do the hotel reservations, do their jobs while they're working from home. Now, granted, there weren't a lot of hotel reservations at the beginning of the pandemic, but since, let's say the midsummer, late fall, they've been running at a pretty decent and consistent capacity of clients coming to their casinos, and these people continue to work at home. And the growth of this Azure services for them is probably going to continue as people, we don't really know what's going to happen going forward, but it seems like people are going to be working from home at least 20, 30, 40, 50%, 60% of the time. So the third modernization trigger became one of the main modernization triggers in 2020. Software and hardware refresh is another common one, right? You've got a Windows server from the 2000s or some hardware that's old and is end of life, end of service. Security threats, compromised systems, as we saw with some big recent attacks out there and SolarWinds and this and that. If you've got some older systems that are, or even systems that are on your environment that are hard to protect, moving things to cloud gives you a completely paradigm shift on how to manage security and can greatly increase your security posture and your compliance posture, which is the next one. It's, the Azure data centers having the checkboxes and all of the compliance settings from the shared compliance model is really important. And then you can then, as a client or working with a company like us, work on various compliance aspects of your data to make sure you hit the compliance posture that's required for your company. Application innovation, delivering applications faster. This is another big key driver to move to Azure. It can be really kind of tough and slow to do some things on premise with, you have to buy new servers and the lead time for that, especially with the pandemic and logistics making it a lot of delays to get some physical hardware out there. Moving things to Azure allows you to do some innovation quicker, and then move also some modernization, move from maybe some server-based things to more app-based things or container things or functions as a service. We'll get to these a little bit later. And that can really, excuse me, help you get in your innovation and deliver apps faster. Excuse me. And then similar to the software hardware refresh is the software end of support, end of life, or you name it. And end of life stuff tends to trigger a lot of other reasons to move services and workloads into Azure. Speaking to the baseline, this slide on the upper left talks about that baseline. So one of the first things we recommend and we do for our clients is doing an assessment. So we come in, we have a whole assessment methodology where we come in and assess the workloads that are targeted to be migrated to Azure. So we come in and do that assessment. Then in the upper middle is the migration. There's more than one way to do a migration. So we've listed some of those migration tools from Microsoft, and then down below some of the third-party migration tools. And then post-migration is then getting into that optimization phase of making sure everything's working right from how it's expected from Azure, maybe some cost management, looking at it, some security and compliance changes, and then just making sure everything is right-sized and is working for you. And then oftentimes after the optimization discussion started is what's called modernization of looking at servers and databases that are candidates to move to containers or server as a service, so on and so forth. Since each migration is different and everybody's data center and workload migrations is custom to them, we really focus on our clients' cloud journey and their hybrid cloud journey, because some clients are going to go super duper fast. Some it's going to be a much slower, more meticulous and methodical approach to the migration, and we take that into account when we're working with our clients on how quickly we're going to move to things, how what's a good pace for it, and then especially if there's some security and compliance requirements, making sure we don't make any mistakes along the way from a security and compliance standpoint. A little bit more about these planning and testing methodologies, but before then, I'm going to click on another poll question. So if you can look here in your screen, click launch. There we go. Did that come across?
Yep.
I meant to say, do you have any plans to migrate workloads, not into Teams, but into Azure? So apologies for that. Just curious to see here who's, I'm expecting this to be a pretty high response of, yeah, we're looking to move things into Azure, which is, I would assume it's high because you're on this webinar for a reason, but I just wanted to still ask that question. All right, 5 more seconds. We're at about 70% yes, looking to move. All right, I'm going to close this poll. Okay, so thanks for that. That relates then to this next slide of moving workloads and services into the cloud. We categorize this in 5 different settings. The slide's a little busy, but we're going to just talk to it at a high level. At the first level there is the Rehost section. So where this says description in the migration and modernization section is really rehosting. Rehosting is deploying as is. So it's basically the lift and shift you might hear, where basically you take for the most part, everything as is, take it from where it is, move it on over to Azure, and then it's moved on over to Azure. That takes it off of the physical environment that it's on, VMware, Hyper-V, list goes on, moves it on over to Azure, reduces your capital expenses. You no longer have to pay for those servers anymore. Frees up data center space, and this is akin to the data center contract expiration. You don't need to use that data center space, whether it's in your own office or at a co-location. And it's a really quick cloud return on investment, because now that you've moved everything over, you can then say bye-bye to your colo, your data center, your servers, and so on and so forth. And that's just a real straight lift and shift. And it's typically the first way we move a workload or multiple workloads into the cloud. After that, or at the same time, it could be, is a refactoring process. Do we want to refactor what you've got and maybe move something to a container or a platform as a service? One of the most popular platform as a services we have for our clients is what Microsoft calls SQL as a service. And SQL as a service is basically SQL Server running as a service. So there's no server, there's no Windows Server, there's no Windows updates, there's no VM you're managing. It's literally just SQL Server as a service, not too dissimilar from Office 365, which has like email as a service. You don't manage an email server anymore in Office 365 because it's just running. So this is one of the more popular things we see with our client base, is moving their databases from the VM with Windows or Linux, and then having SQL Server or MySQL onto a platform as a service with SQL Server or Microsoft database for MySQL. We also see containers becoming really popular and web apps becoming really popular. So instead of running a server with IIS or Apache, let's now just run a web app or a web container and then just service that up to our client base. So that's a really common and typical next step after rehosting is refactoring some of your services. The next 2 are a little more heavier lift, the re-architect and the rebuild or new. Re-architecting is re-architecting. It's a lot of work sometimes, but maybe you've got some older code, or you wrote something 10, 15, 20 years old, and it's got some older encryption methodologies, or it calls to like an old Windows file server, or some old, whatever it is. We will work with our clients on those ones to completely re-architect and redesign everything to be cloud first and cloud focused. And that's similar to the rebuild new, making it a cloud native, where it's from the scratch or from the starting from scratch and building from the ground up these applications and services that are really designed to be cloud native. Those are also platform as a service. They're serverless microservices. You might hear FaaS, which is function as a service. So these are really where you're just running at very small components, like one function, one aspect. And instead of having to, again, have a server or some underlying infrastructure, you're really just running a very small aspect of a service that's just focused on your need. Maybe it's just your web app. Maybe it's just sending triggers back and forth between applications. So that gets into the really re-architecting and focusing on cloud native. And then occasionally we'll get to this one on the far right, which is software as a service. Sometimes we'll have a client come to us and say, hey, I want to move my Exchange server, my email server into Azure. And my first response will be like, hey, why don't you just consider Microsoft 365 and just use Exchange Online? It's already in there for you. And 99 times out of 100, that's what ends up happening, is going to a software as a service. I use that in Office 365, Microsoft 365 as an example, but there are plenty of other software as a service platforms out there, from ADP, the list goes on. And so when we're talking with our clients to these things, we'll also bring that up, because that might be the best way to move a workload, or some workloads, is not really necessarily move it into an Azure virtual machine or container or platform as a service, but just literally leverage a software as a service platform. All right, time check here. We're at 10. Looking at, we're about 10:28. So good. We're on path here. Mike, any questions you've got coming in?
Yeah, I did have one. Hold on, let's get back over here. So wanted to know whether or not you need to move everything into Azure if you're moving up your entire on-premise environment, and if not, how do you decide what to move and what not to move?
Okay, I'm gonna bring up this next slide. It's not completely related to it, but it's somewhat related. It's a continuous circle, as you can see from this slide. So in the very top middle is migrate, and then to answer that question is, we typically look at this as your cloud journey. And your cloud journey is, let's identify the first set of workloads that are good candidates to move, and then go from there. So lift and shifting, all of it can be done, but can be a very heavy lift, depending on the number of servers and services we're talking about. Typically, our clients start with something small, maybe a backup or a database, or some other file services or something like that, and we'll migrate those. Oftentimes then we create a VPN connection between your data center and Azure. And so all those services that are running in your on-premise or colo or data center and running in Azure, they can talk to each other over this VPN connection. And then we'll migrate, and like the top of the slide says, kind of go through a cycle of making sure the security is set up, protecting data with backing up disaster recovery scenarios, monitoring, make sure everything's looking good, any kind of configuration settings, any kind of government settings, and cost management and compliance. And then we get back to the top, and then we go through the next set of services to migrate. So that the answer to that question is, we typically start with something that's palatable for our client and works for them, move it over, kind of a proof of concept, make sure it passes the muster, and then from there, then discuss on the cloud journey, what are the next set of workloads that are good candidates to migrate. Mike, thanks for that. Anything else?
Sure. Nope, that's all I'm at so far.
All right, perfect. Sticking on this slide for a little bit more. Like I said, we hit the migration, so we migrate something over, great, it's there. Now what? Well, let's make sure it's secure. So Microsoft has a product called Azure Security Center, which has a number of great services in it, including a secure score, which will give you a score on how secure your workloads are in Azure. And will give you a set of recommendations on what to do next to make your workloads and services more secure. And there also is an Azure Defender. It's been rebranded from something else. Microsoft's always changing the name of products, so Azure Defender is a relatively newer name. And Azure Defender is a service that can run on virtual machines, databases, storage, and actually provide a level of security on each of these workloads and services, and then give you a set of recommendations on how to make it more secure, and recommendations of what to do. And it also reports up to the security center on things that are happening and if there's any threats being detected. Another question we get asked a lot is, well, now that my data is in Azure, do I have to back it up? Answer is yes. You still have to do backups. So we have a number of backup solutions and disaster recovery solutions that we work with our clients. Monitoring is a really key component. There's a lot of great monitoring services in Azure. They can go really, really deep and monitor not only your virtual machines, but your applications, which virtual machines aren't being used very much, which might be oversized, if there's any connectivity issues people are having. So a lot of great monitoring services in Azure. The configuration aspect, never ending, right? We always configure something, we update it, want it to run better, do some automation and scripting. If you've got a bigger platform in Azure, automate and script some of the configuration and security and compliance settings. Governance, there's identity and access management, our user IDs and passwords, right? And granting access not only into ourselves, into our own Azure environment, but you might have partners and clients that need to access data in your environment. So identity and access management is really key on that. Policy-based management, right? Giving policies to groups of people. And then cost management, I've got that in bold because I've got a slide on that coming up. So again, it's this continuous journey on cloud journey of just making sure we migrate in there, test everything, and continue to migrate, and then modernize those set of services that are great candidates to be modernized into platform as a service, containers, so on and so forth. How's it licensed? How's it priced? We get this all the time too. Like, it's great. These things. Oh,
Hey,
go ahead.
wait, before you jump into that, I do have one more question over here. When moving a legacy application to Azure, specifically SQL application, to convert it to SQL as a service, what sorts of features are going to be missing when you do that, and what are the workarounds?
So one of the in the earlier side when I hit on assessment, that's one thing we assess your SQL environment, and from that assessment comes an output of the candidates, the viability for it to be migrated from a VM to a platform as a service, and then if there's any things that need to be changed in the existing SQL database, that is part of the output, and then we'll discuss that with our client, saying, hey, here are the things that need to be updated, if any, for this to be running as a platform as a service. One thing we see a lot for a platform as a service, anybody who's got to keep their old line of business, maybe an older version of their ERP system, but they don't want to maintain the VM and Windows and all this stuff, they'll move that older line of business application, that SQL data, into a platform as a service and just let it sit there and then do their queries against it. So, so again, in the assessment tools, it assesses the viability of the existing environment, the existing databases to move into Microsoft's SQL platform as a service.
And another important thing to keep in mind there is that Microsoft there's two different, entirely different platforms. When Azure first brought in SQL as a PaaS service, they had hosted SQL services, which are like fancy tables, but not too much else, with some querying capability. A couple of years ago, they brought out actual Azure managed SQL instance, which is now it's code compatible with actual SQL Server. They're guaranteeing something like 95 or 99%.
It's like 99.99 now. Yeah. It's like 4 nines, yeah.
Compatibility, and once you do get your SQL application migrated into managed SQL in Azure, then they're also guaranteeing continued compatibility moving forward. So as they continue to upgrade the service on the back end, once a SQL application is up and running in SQL managed instance, it'll continue to work even as they upgrade the service on the back end. So it's your compatibility is a lot more likely to be successful than it was even 2 or 3 years ago.
Absolutely, yep. Thank you for that, Mike.
Can we migrate Linux-based VMs to Azure and maintain ODBC connectivity to on-prem systems? Well, I mean, with a VPN they can, but
right. Yep. So, I mean, the answer is most likely yes. You can migrate your VMs or start brand new Linux VMs. And sometimes in a migration, we don't actually migrate a virtual machine because somebody might say, you know, this has been running for 15 years and it's got some skeletons in the closet. I just want a new VM. Grab a Linux image or a Windows image out of Azure and then migrate the data. And then with a VPN connection, then yeah, you can have your, you know, your ODBC calls or whatever it is, you know, from on-prem to Azure or vice versa. But if you move the Linux and database into Azure, then if you're doing ODBC calls for reporting or whatever from on-prem or remote, right? A lot of workers are working remote these days. They can client VPN into Azure. They can get in via other methodologies as well, and security and encryption. I mean, you know, secure connecting in. So yeah, all that at a high level, we're going to say all of it can be done. Devil's in the details, depending on what exactly we're talking about, but that's a pretty
Yeah,
common scenario.
site to Azure VPNs are pretty common for most migrations.
Right.
And we're lucky we get enough stuff moved up there that we can tear that down after the fact. But a lot
Yeah.
of our migrations wind up with a site to Azure VPN.
Yeah. Speaking of site to Azure VPNs and costs, how does, what are the costs here? In the bottom middle is the Azure calculator. We don't really like to send our clients there. Mike and I do the Azure calculator together. It's really complex. And Azure has a lot of services in it. So we've got templates we use as a DCO partner with Microsoft. We have kind of super enhanced Excel spreadsheets for doing higher level Azure calculations, but wanted to bring that up there because there was a cost for the VPN. It's usually about between $25, $75 a month, depending on some of the VPN settings. Could be more depending on if you're doing huge amounts of bandwidth, but we do these cost estimations routinely with Azure Calculator. And then there's also ways to effectively manage your costs. One on the left is save with your existing licenses. If you're eligible, you can bring some licenses up to Azure and save some money there. In the middle there is reserving upfront, paying less. Microsoft has this terminology called reserved instances, where you can reserve instances for 12 or 36 months. And because of that reservation, you end up paying less. And then lastly, here's some extended security updates. If you are running SQL Server 2008, Windows Server 2008, and believe it or not, we have a number of clients that are, if you need those extended security updates from Microsoft, ESUs, they're available for a fee and it's not inexpensive. But if you move your VMs running Windows Server 2008, SQL Server 2008 into Azure, you get the ESUs, the extended security updates for free. So that's why one of the reasons we don't like to send everybody to the Azure calculator, because there's a whole bunch of what if scenarios, and we work with our clients on those what if scenarios to ensure that their Azure spend stays within their budget and expectations. Related to that, a relatively new feature within Azure within the past year is a very long phrase, Azure Cost Management plus Billing. And here's a screenshot from the Azure, the typical Microsoft Contoso test environment. And this cost management solution gives you a nice cost analysis of what's driving your costs in Azure, and you can do it over, this one's a short time frame, it looks like it's a month. You can do it over a year, days, weeks, whatever. And then from this and a tool called Azure Advisor come recommendations on how to reduce your costs. So some of them might be, and I hit on a few of these earlier, hey, this virtual machine's oversized. It's got 8 CPUs or vCPUs, 64 gigs of RAM, and barely anybody's touching it. Or you're paying for this set of services that nobody's using. Or move to a platform as a service, move to SQL Server as a service, and you're going to get some cost savings. So this is something we work with our clients a lot on, is using Azure Cost Management plus Billing and Azure Advisor to really look at your costs and then make recommendations on some best next steps on how to manage that cost and then reduce it as needed, or at least plan if you're adding more to Azure, your spend's going to go up, but let's do it in a very disciplined manner that meets within your budgeting and your expectations and everything that goes along with managing any kind of costs in Azure. No surprise, Azure is a consumption model, so it's kind of like gasoline for your car or electricity for your house. The more you use, the higher the cost. So just, a lot of great strategies out there. If you're in a DevOps environment, you might turn off some VMs at nighttime when people aren't working. And that sounds really simple, but it works in a DevOps environment. Can't do it in production, but maybe, there are some ways to manage stuff, or there's storage lifecycle management. If something hasn't been touched in 90 days, move it to a different tier of storage that costs less. So lots of ways to manage costs, and Azure Cost Management plus Billing is a great place to start. One of the last agenda items is a roadmap, Azure Roadmap. This is always, a very fun, kind of interesting stuff, like what's happening, right? Like what is Microsoft coming out with? And as I took a screenshot of the Azure Roadmap URL, and this URL is in the slide deck, so you don't have to, again, worry about writing it down, is general availability of soft delete for Azure files. So if you're using Azure files, there's now a soft delete. Think of like a trash. So if you accidentally fat finger something, and I fat finger all the time, if you accidentally fat finger something, there's now a soft delete for Azure files. Hey, that's great. So this website here lists on the main page all of the most recent updates. I looked at it again this morning. Of course, it's different today than when I took the screenshot yesterday, because it's one day later. And Azure in many ways is a DevOps platform because it has, it's always changing, always evolving. But you click on this link here, takes you to the Azure Updates page. On the bottom right, I couldn't quite get that in there in the screenshot, but on the bottom right, you'll see kind of a download of historical updates for by month and by the most recent quarters. And then you can go back another link there and see all the updates for past years. Some of the kind of key recent roadmap updates as I went through them, just to kind of give you an example of what some of the recent updates are. One is that soft delete for Azure files that's on there. There's been there's monthly updates on Internet of Things. So if you're doing any Internet of Things devices out there, there's a monthly update that Microsoft publishes on this roadmap. There's a new stop-start functionality for Azure databases for MySQL. So if you're trying to, again, manage your cost, and you can have a little stop and start button and automate that, you can stop and start that MySQL database service when you don't need it, and start it up again and automate that. So great way to manage some costs. Then there's also been some public preview and general availability updates for the Azure Security Center, which we mentioned earlier, helps manage security, your secure score, and Microsoft is routinely putting things into public preview from a security standpoint, and then making them generally available. So that's just a recent snapshot of just this month. If you were to go through this, you'll just see oodles and oodles of stuff, and of course you can search on here and just search for updates and see what's happening, what's being worked on. Next steps. Okay, we're near the end of the presentation here, so it's like, great, Wade, where are we? Next steps. As I mentioned, we have an Azure readiness assessment. So this is where we come in, do those assessment steps we talked about, assess your workloads for migration, including assessing databases and if they're candidates for SQL as a service, MySQL as a service. So we do this readiness assessment. We come in, I shouldn't say we come in because we don't visit too much anymore because of the pandemic, but we get into your environment and look at it and see what it's going to be to, how to migrate those workloads, what the cost is going to be in Azure once it's there, and then the level of effort, about the number of hours to make that migration. So any interest in that, just let us know. This is a routine assessment we do. It's kind of like Jiffy Lube for us. We do this all the time. So we're doing these assessments all the time here. And then related to assessments and costs, we also do license assessments, license discussions all the time, and not only on Azure, Office 365, regular, Windows Server purchasing, cloud solution providers purchasing, software asset management, especially if you've got an enterprise agreement. So kind of dovetailing from the Azure assessment and pricing just to overall pricing, because we really like to look at your cost and pricing as a whole and not just Azure. So that's it. That's the end of the presentation here, hitting on all things Azure migration. So a big thank you from Mike and I, and from Jeff Rogers, our CEO. As I mentioned here are the links that I referred to during the presentation. So they're here as one of the slides that'll be sent to you by Chuck. And now we're at the Q&A section. So Mike, any more questions you got coming in?
I don't. I see somebody typing. Hold on, but I don't see you yet. Let's see. No, that's not that one. I do have one person that wants to know how, what sort of bandwidth is required for an Azure migration if they're moving on-premise to the cloud.
And that comes as part of the assessment as well. So if you've got a really constricted bandwidth, right, that's going to slow the migration. There are ways to actually copy data from a data center or your colo and actually ship it to Azure, to a Microsoft Azure data center with what's called data box, and then it gets ingested into your Azure environment. So we'll look at that and determine on the amount of data you have and the bandwidth. Is this copying of data and migrating data going to take days, weeks, years? And if it is some sort of threshold that's way too high, then we would discuss the data box scenarios of copying it to a hard drive locally that comes from Microsoft and then shipping it to the Azure data center and having it ingested.
Got it. And then does it matter? Oh, let's see. With a 500 gigabyte database, does it take much bandwidth to keep it in sync between Azure and on-prem?
So that's a really good question. That's a database elasticity question. And again, it depends on kind of on the transactional aspect of that database and what it's being used for. If it's being used all the time and there's a lot of extension of the database or whatever it is, we would then test that to measure the bandwidth. And if it's just, hey, we get an update once a day or once a batch runs every night, and then it's just after that batch, like let's say a company that posts invoices and they post their invoices at night and then just that gets uploaded, that would be less. So I always hate giving these it depends answers, but in the reality, it really depends on the transactional status of a database and what's actually being transmitted.
Yeah, the size of the database doesn't really. I mean, we have customers with databases that are terabytes in size and don't have much activity, and then you can have a 100 gigabyte database where every record's being rewritten multiple times a day, and it's really hard to tell just with that. Two more. 10 outside offices. They all have their own server.
Okay.
I'm assuming because of internet speed issues. Is there a recommended internet connection for those offices so they won't have issues when accessing data if they move everything into Azure? That's one I need more information too.
Yeah. There are ways to synchronize data. If you're so on that environment, if we're going to keep, let's say we keep a server or storage in those 10 locations, there are ways to synchronize data either between Azure or if it's files, it might be better to use Office 365 to synchronize information between the sites, which could help if there are some bandwidth issues. There's also a lot of new edge technology from Microsoft that deals with disconnected or internet challenged environments. So depending on what kind of workload or services we're talking about, there's more than one way to potentially tackle this.
Right. Another question here. Do we have remote desktop as a service within Azure? And that's a straightforward one. That's actually WVD. It's a separate branded service. It does run in Azure. The licensing is handled as part of Microsoft 365, but it is an Azure service. We've had other webinars that you can look up if you want to pull those down on that topic specifically. But it's one of the most popular Azure services that we've been working with, obviously, for the past year or so. A lot of new developments. Some of you may have seen something called Cloud PC out in the media in the past couple of weeks, which is it's WVD in Azure with some other enhancements in management best practices and whatnot to do things in Intune, but that's one of our specialties is WVD. Another question, if we turn up a VM in Azure, can I use a tool such as VMware Migration tools to move current servers into Azure?
Mike, do you know if VMware does migration itself, in and of itself?
Well, so I don't think that's going to work specifically because the VMware migration tools would generally require a VMware hypervisor at the other side.
Right.
Into Azure is kind of its own hypervisor in the cloud. You can move VMware machines or Hyper-V machines. We can migrate those into Azure, no problem. But once they get there, the host or guest operating systems, the guest operating systems that run on the host in Azure, they're not being managed by VMware or Hyper-V directly anymore. They're being managed by Azure. That being said, there is an Azure product, which is it's essentially a bare metal Azure installation that runs VMware. So if you really want or need to do actual live VM migrations in an active VMware environment, but you'd like some of that to be in the cloud, that is a separate Azure product that runs a VMware native hypervisor on Azure Metal in the cloud, and that would give you some advanced VMware back and forth simultaneous functionality that you wouldn't need Azure stuff for. It's a little pricey. If you're not planning on spending $50,000 a month in Azure, then the bare metal VMware product isn't going to make sense for you. Most of the time, you don't need to use VMware's migration tools anyway, because Azure Migrate supports the VMware hypervisor natively as well. So it will move those operating systems, those guest VMs, it'll migrate them directly into Azure. It breaks the VMware along the way because you're not going to have VMware manage them once they get into Azure, but it'll take those instances and migrate them right up. And
there was something in the second half of last year where, in addition to what Mike's talking about, there are as a kind of a VMware Microsoft partnership of some a lighter weight VMware set of services in Azure. I think that's still in preview, but let us know. We can definitely research that and get back to you.
And then another question here is, what happens when the internet connection is lost?
Right, and that's discussed a lot, right? Because you do need internet access, obviously, to get into Azure, just like you need internet access to get to Office 365 or your favorite social media site, or the list goes on. So internet access is required. There are sync mechanisms to synchronize some, not everything, but some data to your local device. So if you are offline and you need to edit something, files is a great example. You can synchronize files to your computer. But again, internet access is required to get into Azure.
Yeah, and as far as what happens when the connection is lost, that depends significantly on what happens for who. So if you have your host, if you have your services all running in Azure and your office internet connection goes down, if you have other offices or customers or other applications that are working with the applications in Azure, they're not going to be affected at all. Because your office internet went out.
Right.
Internet to Azure directly pretty much never goes down. So that's.
Or if you have like an iPhone like me with a hotspot on it, you just go to your hotspot. Maybe your whole office might not be able to go on my hotspot, but there's a lot of ways these days, as opposed to years ago when Mike and I were running companies and in the IT departments, and you had to have do I have internet access and another failover one? That discussion is a little different these days because it's so easy to get on with this or something else as a hotspot.
Right. Another question here is, and I'll take this one. Do Barracuda backup appliances work within Azure? They do. In fact, Barracuda is an Azure partner that we deal with pretty frequently. They have versions of their appliances that run natively in Azure. So what usually happens is if you've got an old pizza box backup appliance that runs on premise now, if we can work with your Barracuda rep, and we can generally get those licenses changed so that instead of licensing the pizza box appliance, you're licensing their cloud appliance, which is the same software and functionality with different enhancements because it's running in Azure. But then you're licensing the Barracuda software running on an Azure virtual machine as opposed to running on your on-prem appliance. And depending on how old it is and which exact product you have from Barracuda, a lot of times we can make that a seamless licensing change from on-prem to the cloud, so you don't even lose your investment that you've got already.
Yep.
Well,
that's a good amount of questions.
No, I think that's it.
All right.
Oh, wait, hold on. Nope. Squeak him in just under the
Oh,
wire.
coming at the last minute for the
Um,
win.
does Azure have a backup solution to replace Veeam or other on-prem local backups?
So Azure does have a backup solution called Azure Backup. We do sell Azure Backup. That being said, we do really look at your backup environment. We do a lot of Veeam backups as well. So depending on the feature set you need, Azure Backup, the native Azure Backup might not be sufficient. And in that case, we would look at Veeam. Veeam works very well with Azure.
Yeah.
And so does Barracuda. We're a Barracuda partner, we're a Veeam partner, we're other backup partners. So the answer is yes, Azure does have it, but we would really look at your environment to make sure Azure's the right fit. It's use case scenarios that's kind
And
of smaller than a Veeam or a Barracuda.
yeah, Azure, we do this one a lot too. Azure Backup works extremely well for VMs running in Azure, especially if you have everything in Azure. It's robust, it's reliable, it works like every time, and it's super easy to set. It's a checkbox to get it set up and running. It's not as easy to manage a large campus environment if you've got multiple locations and a mixture of on-premise and cloud resources that you want to back up. You're going to get a better, more concise and cohesive view of your backup real estate with something like Veeam. You're going to pay for it, but and it's going to be a little more involved to manage because with the Veeam backup servers and other pieces that you need to manage. But it really depends. We have back to assessments again. We have a specific backup assessment, and we're usually looking for 3 or 4 different outcomes out of that assessment. One of them is Azure Backup, because Azure Backup is capable of replacing the other on-premise backup solutions like Veeam and all the old backup execs and whatnot that have been out there. But just because we can do it doesn't mean we want to do it. There's several things to take into consideration before you make that decision. Is it possible for ransomware to delete my Veeam backups in Azure? Well, I no one ever want to say it's not possible. It would be very difficult to pull off something like that in Azure. Something specific about Azure and backups is all Azure backups run in a recovery services vault. And recovery services vaults have separate additional layers of protection that specifically prevent against mass deletions. And the mass deletions could be for a ransomware event or human error, what the case may be. There's a whole, like another 7-day, even after you delete and shift, click, delete all the deletions, there's another 7 days where that data is still in Azure in a recovery services vault. No matter how hard you try to delete it, whether on accident or on purpose, there's a whole nother week. Plus there are additional PIN-based challenge levels of security that are required beyond your regular multi-factor authentication when you're going to delete out recovery services vaults. There's email and text alerts when recovery service vaults, certain operations like trying to change the passkey or other sensitive operations. When somebody tries to do that, there's another set of alerts. So specifically in a backup vault situation, there's a whole nother layer of protections that are built in and to that specifically so that it's difficult for something like ransomware to take it out.
Yep. And hey, I know we're at the 11 o'clock Pacific time hours. I know we're at the end of the presentation. I'm leaving this slide deck up to LinkedIn profiles for me, Mike, and our CEO Jeff Rogers. The cloud consultation migration assessment we hit on. We also hit on a backup assessment, data center optimization. We have the highest level of support from Microsoft called Premier Support. And then we're also on Microsoft's Partner Advisory Council. And then worst acronym ever, International Association of Microsoft Channel Partners, IAMCP, which means we work with a lot of other partners out there. So, but for everybody on the call, Mike and I aren't going anywhere. We're staying, but I do know that some people do have to leave here at 11. So if keep firing away your questions, and then we'll end here when the questions are. Or do we still have more questions, Mike? Or are we done?
That might be it. And we might
Okay.
be nice. We could just write it up exactly at the hour.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to meet with us and discuss Azure migration. As mentioned earlier, Chuck's going to be following up with a PDF of this presentation, and all the links are there. And please don't hesitate to contact me or Mike or Jeff or Chuck with any questions. And hope to see you on our very next webinar. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everybody.